All right, and it's 1/2 past, so I think we're just going to get started. I think more people might be coming in as we speak, but let's not waste any time because we have two amazing presentations today, I think. So welcome to this very last session of today's start of our MCICM Symposium, Borderlands. We have here today with us Anna Ramstedt and Søren Michael Rasmussen. Warm welcome to the both of you. I very much look forward to your talks. My name is Denise Petzold. I'm a PhD candidate at the MCICM, and I have the immense pleasure of moderating this session. Maybe a few notes on housekeeping. Of course, Carolee's much better than I, but please do keep your microphones muted during the talks so we can hear the speakers well and there's no interference. And after each talk, we will have a short Q&A session. So collect your questions. I will also be monitoring the chat for anything that comes in, and we're going to discuss it after each talk. So without further ado, I want to introduce our first speaker, Anna Ramstedt. Anna is a pianist, music educator, and doctoral student. She has studied piano performance at the Sibelius Academy, as well as Middle Eastern Studies and Musicology at the University of Helsinki. After she graduated from both universities, she continued to pursue her PhD at the University of Helsinki, which she is still busy with, I believe. And the topic of her project is the audible gender, and it sounds fascinating. I'm really curious to hear what you will talk about today. You basically study the construction of racial and gendered inequality, whiteness, as well as gendered and sexual misconduct, and also very interesting, the abuse of power in the classical music scene in Finland, the latter of which you will also talk about today, I believe. So without further ado, Anna, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Denise. I'm trying to share the screen now. I hope you all can hear me well. If not, let me know.
We can hear you perfectly. Yes.
Great. Okay. So, hi, everyone. First, I want to thank the organizing committee for welcoming me to have this presentation. The theme of this conference is very near to my heart, so I can't wait to listen to the rest of all of the presentation, and thank you for everybody who presented so far. So the title of my talk today is "You Are Just Too Used to Tolerate Everything: Gendered and Sexual Misconduct and Abuses of Power in the Classical Music Scene in Finland." And before I proceed, I want to give a content warning and say that this presentation contains content that is disturbing, such as harassment, abuse, bullying, and experiences of emotional abuse. So I encourage you to take care of your safety and well-being in considering on whether or not to listen to this presentation. So sexual harassment is a widespread phenomena in every part of the society. Ignited by Tarana Burke's #MeToo movement, sexual harassment, also in classical music, has become a widely acknowledged phenomena with statistics to show for it. It has been a recurring topic in the media, both in Finland as elsewhere, which suggests that there might be common factors why it is in classical music such a common problem. My research question, therefore, is: how do understandings of gender and sexuality, traditional hierarchies, and common practices of classical music allow for gendered and sexual misconduct and abuses of power? Now, firstly, to understand what I'm exactly doing research on, it's relevant to define gendered and sexual misconduct and abuses of power. So there is no single universal definition on sexual harassment. However, it's commonly defined according to the legal definition, which in Finland, as well as elsewhere, connects sexual harassment with unwanted behavior. However, many of the interviewees in this research realized only years later that they had experienced grooming or harassment or even been in abusive relationships. So in this article, I define gendered and sexual misconduct in a very broad manner, especially leaning on the research by Page, Bull, and Chapman. So it is harassment, sexualized communication, bullying or revenge behavior, grooming, which is the preparation for harassment, or generalized sexist statements. Abuses of power are defined how it appears in the research material, which is emotional abuse, such as belittling, humiliation, intentional denial of attention, harsh and cruel comments, and intentionally setting up a student for failure. About the methodology of this paper, so it's based on 14 interviews with professional pianists, violinists, cellists, and violists that are all white cisgender Finnish women between the ages 25 and 45. Most of the participants have asked the material to be destroyed after completing the research, emphasizing thus the significant ethical issues of anonymity of the participants in this research. And to ensure the anonymity, none of the citation are referred to by name, not even pseudonym. And just like the interviews, I'm myself also a white cisgender woman, classical pianist. My research position could therefore be labeled as an insider researcher. However, as Sonia Corbin-Dwyer and Jennifer Buckle point out, and I quote, holding membership in a group doesn't denote complete sameness within that group. And indeed, I position myself in many in-betweens of self and other in relation to social positions. And perhaps most notably, I'm a white woman. And most probably because of this, only other white women wish to participate in this research. So it's important to state and to remember that this research offers only a limited understanding of inequality within the classical music scene in Finland. And further, despite the media attention of this phenomena, there is almost no research on this in classical music culture. But this paper builds upon an abundance of research on sexual misconduct and abuses of power in coach-athlete relationships, as well as in academia between staff and students. Now, building upon these studies, this paper contributes to understand how underlying inequality and social fabrics can contribute to normalize abuses of power and gendered and sexual misconduct. Now, to analyze the social fabrics, I turn to feminist philosopher Moira Gatens and her writings. Gatens uses the notion of social imaginary to refer to the ways gendered bodies are represented in culture, in symbols, in metaphors, in representation and narratives, and so on. Further, Gatens writes that social imaginaries encompass also other aspects, out of which moral values are important in this research. I use this notion to understand what kind of understanding of gender and sexuality, as well as what kind of moral values can be dissected from the interviewee's experiences. Further, I draw upon Jennifer Hirsch and Seamus Khan's exhaustive study of sex, power, and assault in university campuses. Through Hirsch and Khan's study and their understanding of power, I analyze how power is distributed through associated social imaginaries in the socio-cultural conditions, such as the social spaces specific to classical music practice. Now, I have divided the analysis part as such, and we will start with the first one. So, gendered and sexual misconduct. The interviewees had experienced everything from very subtle sexualized touching from their teachers to direct sexual invitations, such as receiving text messages from men in authority positions to invite them to have sex, or sexist gender statements, especially in orchestras. One interview explained that in her workplace, the orchestra, and I quote, there were all kind of inappropriate suggestions. As a young orchestra musician, she had been faced with comments such as, well, now we got here a 25-year-old toy, of course she wants to go through us all. Or, and I quote, look at, she's smiling at him, she probably fucked him. One interviewee explained that as a high school student, she had been harassed by her instrumental teacher's older colleague. When she had told her own teacher about this, he had answered that, and I quote, you do understand that men like you, don't you? And the teacher's reply can actually be analyzed twofolded. Firstly, the teacher suggested that as a late teenager or / young woman, the student should have known to expect attention by men. But secondly, that harassment was by the teacher assumed to be a natural part of the heteronormative attention given by men. And interestingly so, these two problematic ideas frequently came up elsewhere in the interview material. Subtle cases of misconduct were by so many explained as normal, and some interviewees had learned to live with it. On the other hand, while women were sexualized and associated with heteronormative gender and sexual availability, men were occasionally in the interview material depicted as predators who may easily start to take advantage of particularly younger women. And I quote one, "I have lived in a world where it is not understood how inappropriate it is that an old man and a very young instrumentalist girl have an affair, and I'm talking about a barely 18-year-old. So consequently, gender and sexual misconduct was not only expected, but also partly accepted. I argue that this confirms that gender and sexual misconduct is partly normalized in classical music culture, as it is seen an unfortunate part of it. Churchill and Gatens write that social imaginaries confer differential meanings and values on particular bodies and practices and establish collective norms of behavior. I want to turn the attention to how classical music culture promotes social imaginaries that celebrate men's agency and authority while diminishing women's value and agency. Namely, the surrounding culture with traditions and practices indeed also indirectly participate in upkeeping heteronormative gender hierarchies that are at play here. Viewing always white men as authority figures, leading artists, composers, and so on, while through exclusion seeing women, Black, Indigenous, and people of color as less valuable, also promotes inequality that surfaces as the underlying background for gendered and sexual misconduct. And then on to abuses of power. So Hirsch and Kahn maintain, and I quote, "Space has a social power that elicits and produces behavior. The historically long-standing hierarchical setting related to the master and pupil traditions of classical music lessons was mentioned by the interviewees several times. This is related also to the typical spatial setting of classical music instrumental lessons, which happen in one-on-one situation, usually behind closed doors, that are even often soundproof doors. These kind of closed spaces are supposed to offer safe learning environments with trusted adults, but may actually also make unequally distributed power even more pronounced. Illustrating this, another theme that came up was emotional abuse, which I defined earlier. One interview explained that, and I quote, "In classical music, it's so that the teacher's ambition is more important than the child's well-being." Another interviewee recalled that her experience as a child and teenager in student orchestra, stating that, and I quote, "The value of the person was based on their playing skills. People were pretty much appreciated based on how well they played and how good musicians they could become." She further elaborated that children learned very quickly that the cherished persons are the good players, and those that aren't so good are like second-class people, and were even cast aside and intentionally ignored by the teachers. On the other hand, one interview stated that, and I quote, "It doesn't matter if you're an asshole and behave inappropriately or so, because your musicianship can forgive that all." Now, researchers in athlete maltreatment, Ashley Sterling and Gretchen Kerr, maintain that while young athletes may lack psychological maturity to think critically about abusive relationships, power is also more likely to use negatively in a sport culture that idealizes and prioritizes athletic performance above the best interesting or well-being of the athlete. Moral philosopher Torbjörn Tännsjö has done research on Olympic Games, nationalism, and ideologies, and he states that enthusiasm over individual athletic heroes springs from the admiration for strength and contempt for weakness. And in many instances in my research material, the classical music instrumental teacher's behavior was consciously or subconsciously based on a narrative in which the student's well-being was considered as less important than the musical target or standard. I refer to this as a social imaginary that reflected moral values and which emerged as a background that determined how students in some cases were treated. This is continuously also verified, I argue, through representation in classical music canon. This dominance that reaffirms this romantic myth of genius contributes also to a social imaginary which idealizes and prioritizes musical skills and art with associated gendered ideals. As I explained earlier, it is through social imaginaries that value and status of social bodies are determined. and codes of conduct are created. And following Tensche, the valuing of musicians according to their musical skills observed by several of my interviewees can also be construed as affirming the opposite. That person who did not exhibit sufficient skills were not valued, but instead treated with contempt and condescension. Now, unfortunately, I can't get in depth into grooming, which means the strategies that prepare students for possible harassment or abusive relationship. But indeed, some interviews had abusive relationship with their teachers. And I argue that grooming and ending up in abusive relationships was facilitated through the social imaginaries that I discussed earlier. So to summarize this all, I argue the following. So gender imaginaries that view women in heterosexual gender hierarchies available for men, and the social imaginaries that puts musical performance and musicianship above the well-being of the students, facilitates gender and sexual misconduct. And further, these cases were very difficult to report because of the ways the power was constructed and power structures in classical music. So in the material, the teachers did not only have power due to structural advantage, such as being teachers or conductors or professors, but also as older individuals, they had more psychological maturity than their students, and most probably more sexual experience than young women of this research, making it possible for them to be at ease in sexual situations. Further, they also enjoyed the social power in form of social influence. And as this interview material suggests, social power in form of influence over networks is extremely important factor in getting career opportunities. So these factors facilitated also grooming and facilitated the fact that some of these interviews ended up in abusive relationships. Further, arrows could be drawn here back and forth because this is a cycle that keeps repeating itself in some ways. And experiences of abuses of power, gender and sexual misconduct had serious impact on the interviewees, ranging from anxiety, panic attacks, sleep deprivation, and more. And I'm really looking forward to any questions or discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anna, for this immensely important presentation, I believe. I do have about 1,000 questions myself, but I do want to open up the floor to the audience and see who has a question or a comment for Anna. Otherwise, I will make a start. Okay, well, maybe then let me start, and then I'll take my chance. So thank you so much. I think that's more than immensely important. And I have a lot of questions. Maybe just let me ask one so other people can join the discussion, hopefully. I was really wondering about how you did that kind of research methodologically. I was really impressed also by how you handled the kind of responsible way in which you handled also doing this presentation, having a trigger warning in the beginning, you know, really also, yeah, taking care of the experiences that the students have made during their education. And could you maybe tell us a little more about the sort of reactions that you received from the students for this research? I would really be interested in hearing more about that.
Sure, this is an important aspect of the research. Well, not all of them were students anymore. As I said, it's ranged from 25 to 45, but the experiences of gender and sexual misconduct and abuses of power were mainly from their years when they were students. So I felt like many of the interviewees were very happy in general that this is like talked about, and this is now an ongoing discussion, or has been in the Finnish media in many ways. So I felt like they wanted to share this information. But of course, this is like, because the the community is so small in Finland that I have, for example, asked them all to read through the citation before I send the article, or before I sent it to peer review process. And also, I'm not giving any information in the single citations or on what instrument they played and so on and so forth. So I try to blur as much as possible, and they have verified themselves that they are not recognizable from the comments.
Yeah, thank you. So is there anyone who would like to share some insights or has a question?
Hello. Yeah,
Hi.
I would like to ask, because you said like most of the interviews were experiences they had when they were students, but is there like a trend like they keep yeah, like they became victims like also throughout their professional careers because of these experiences they had when they were students?
I can say that I would have noticed such a trend, but many of course also it didn't happen only when they were students, but also in orchestras. Many of them had experienced sexism in many different ways. But I did not, in my research, notice that, or they didn't report that it would have had an impact, that they would have had more experiences later because they had it as students.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yes, and I see Paulina has a question.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the powerful presentation. I'm researching gender occupational segregation in classical music, so I was wondering if you could test some link between sexual misconduct and maybe women being pushed forward towards certain tasks or areas within the field. That would be very interesting to know. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, that's an amazing question, and that's what I'm doing my third article now about, is about networks, and it's based on the same interview material on what comes up there. Well, first of all, I think everything links together, like this kind of what I talk about, the social imaginary, which comes from the canon or from the practices in classical music. Well, in my first article, I actually discuss about ideals and how the women of this research felt like in order to be recognized as a good classical musician, especially violinists, felt that there were many these kind of like gendered appearance norms that they were supposed to also adhere to, such as being thin, preferably blonde with short skirts and so on and so forth. It goes on. But also, it was difficult for many to get professional credibility. And this impacted also in their networking. So who is the kind of classical musician that can access these kind of networks to get career opportunities? And I think this, many of the women, because they couldn't, and this is maybe a larger trend than in Finland, that if you can't kind of get into the soloist, the kind of thing that you're being educated for, right, to perform the canonical repertoire and so forth, and then you start to do something else, like, and I mean maybe perform music outside of the canon, it's often not recognized professionally as you know, as credible. It's not as professional classical music as it is to perform the canonical works, and that in many ways has impacts on these well, women working in classical music. It would be very interesting to hear more about your research, Paulina.
I would love to stay in touch. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. Then we'll have Guru with a question. You're still muted.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, now. Thank you very much for this presentation. I wanted to ask if any of these men have been sued, or yeah, or did I miss it? Has it been talked about? I don't know.
These are questions that I can't really comment on, because I'm not commenting on any way who did this, and not to you know, jeopardize anybody's of the interviewee's anonymity. But there are a lot of like, not related to my research, but there in general a lot about this written in the newspapers in Finland. So
Yeah,
But
I mean, knowing about it is something else, but has there any processes about these people? That's what I because, you know, without legal consequences, I don't think we can change this kind of attitude. Of course, I mean, just the realizing that it happens and people criticizing it is one thing, but people being really punished for their behavior would be a real good outcome.
sure, yes, of course. But also, I think in order to not have these at all, it should be like talked about in a more broader manner than only like individual cases, because in the way individual cases are only that already when it happened, but what to do with the classical music culture in not to what's the word, like to prevent these things from happening. But unfortunately, I can't comment on what happened to these
yeah, of course. Yeah. No, I mean, to prevent, to be able to talk about these things is like, I think really the first step. And then to eliminate these people from the classical music society could be the second step. And for the second step to take place, there should be many more examples that it is really not accepted. Because, yeah, I mean, I don't know if we all know, but I also know personally a lot of people who have experienced, or also a lot of musicians who are having huge careers. No one talks about that. And since I haven't experienced anything in that sense personally, I cannot start a process about that. But yeah, it's really heartbreaking to see those people giving concerts and knowing all the stories told. That's what I meant. It would be encouraging.
Yeah, but I think it has to do also with this kind of discussion, like, is art more important than the person, you know? Like, separate art from the person, because I think that's a very problematic discussion. But I think it often comes to that, like, it doesn't matter if you did this and that because they're amazing artists and so on. And on the other hand, that also, I think, which I talk about in the article, that I believe that definitely doesn't separate art from person, but that shows that that it doesn't matter what you have done, because you value the musicianship of the person, and you like, that's more important than the well-being of the students and all of that. But it's a very, very it's a huge discussion, I think, and a problem in classical music, like why it keeps happening.
Yes, I think it's indeed important to think about and I think that's also what you say, Guru, right? The idea of what happens after you report such a case. The reporting is, of course, the first step, but how does that play out and what happens after this? And of course, it's the aspect of prevention, right? It's this, what we often hear as young women or girls, educate your sons, right? The idea of don't teach students how to defend themselves, teach teachers to be better persons. And maybe I can just have a quick question for Lise, because Lise, you're here from the Royal Conservatoire, and I think Anna has talked about how this, how also classical music educational systems with one-on-one learning and these more traditional forms of teaching have played into that. Do you maybe have some thoughts on the matter?
Yes, there's a lot going on, of course, and there has been a raising awareness tremendously for the last few years. But when I speak of, perhaps I'm not playing the devil's advocate here, but the awareness has risen that much that some teachers feel uncomfortable now to be in the same room with a student one-on-one. So we're now actually in the process of investigating how can we find the balance to have a personal relationship and not not intrusive, not in using intrusive measures, but still have safe environments for everybody. So, for example, leaving doors open, never being in a classroom just with one student, but opening it up for everybody. Have glass doors, have some kind of built-in systems that actually become more natural, and of course, the possibility always to speak up. We give from the very first moment to teachers as well as to students, okay, this is how the system works. You are in a certain situation. This is what you can do. this is a communication you can follow, and if you don't dare to do it directly to a teacher, if you feel uncomfortable, there are systems in place. And the same for a teacher, if she or he doesn't feel comfortable either, just to say something, if a student walks in with a very short skirt, you don't dare to look or don't dare to say something. Okay, you can also express as a teacher your concerns on how should I react, what can I do, how can I keep a safe environment for everybody. So it is, it has changed tremendously over the last few years.
Yeah, indeed, and hopefully it will continue to change. I think that's maybe the end. A good end for this discussion, sort of natural end.
Can I quickly just point out that actually Anna Bull is also now doing research on how to prevent this and about like classical music as a conducive context for this.
Yeah, and indeed I think also her first book, The Class Control and Classical Music, sort of also brings that up a bit. So whoever is interested, look up Anna's work, both Anna's work. And yes, and we're going to continue. And I'm also very, very happy to have Søren here today with us. Søren is an expert in management, business development, audience development, as well as innovation and analysis. And he collected his expertise during his work for Denmark's radio culture, TV2 Ost, P4 Copenhagen, I think, and Denmark's Radio Science. And today, Søren is the director of Rasmus and Nordic, which is an organization that helps museums, theaters, orchestras, and other cultural organizations to strengthen their content, their programs, and their business and innovation strategies. And today, Søren will tell us more about audience development in Danish orchestra practices. And we will have to improvise a bit because I have to share Søren's presentation.
We will.
Yes, so please do forgive me if I'm bad at catching up with you, Søren, and give me a sign.
Yeah. I will just tell you on the way.
Exactly.
And thank you for that nice introduction, Denise. And thank you. I would also like to thank the board for inviting me to do this presentation from Denmark. We are in Scandinavia in this section. We're talking about innovation and business development. It's a very short lecture now, so just comment a little bit about what innovation is also like. But it started back in 2019, where the Danish Orchestra Organization were looking into trouble because the years ahead there had been some quite heavy cutbacks on state funding and local funding, and at the same time, the demands for the orchestras and the ensembles had risen. So there were now more demands for reaching wider audiences and reaching a more diverse audiences and to reach out to children and youngsters in absolutely new ways. So this combination of lower spending from the state and more demands called for action, and it called for action within innovation. So we made a lot of interviews with all the symphony orchestras and the ensembles, and we did the analysis across all of these. I think we had 24, 26 in-depth interviews to build on, so a lot of data was collected. I would like to start with what actually worked well, because that's a good starting point when we're looking at innovation and business development. But because what we found was that many of the orchestras were actually very good at developing new formats. They had the capability and they were quite excited about developing new formats for these kind of audiences. In particular, we saw a lot of new formats for children, kindergarten, public school, high school, even baby concerts, as many of you probably also know, and all of them was more or less a part of an educational scheme. So it was an answer to some of the demands. And then they started we saw that they had some experiments with formats for what we call young urban people, and it was more relaxed concerts as what you usually see in a classical concert. You could bring in your wine and your beer, and you could just, you know, be more relaxed, and the attitude was absolutely much more relaxed than normally. And we saw a lot of cross genres taking place. So generally, there was a good amount of creativity, and we also saw that they were moving outside the concert hall in pop-up formats. For instance, the first picture you saw here on the screen was a pop-up concert in a gym. So they were trying to reach out in very different ways. But creativity is only a small part of innovation, but the creativity part was actually quite well working. But let me take you through one of the 7 most important findings that we think we had about the barriers for innovation. I'll just connect them with some brief introductions to innovation. The first thing was that though they were very good at this work, there was no real strategy why they were doing so. And that's a barrier for innovation, because innovation is expensive. So when you start using money about developing formats, you should be quite aware of why you're doing it, who you're doing it for, what's the long-term what's the long-term idea about doing this. So they were absolutely having artistic strategies, but not strategies for gaining all of these new audiences and how to harvest on their creativity. And the next thing was that, I wouldn't say much to our surprise, but you know, there was really no gathering of audience data. There was a little bit gathering of some ticket data, but all of the data you would normally collect in other branches about audience satisfaction and why audience attended, where they come from, how many concerts this year, what they were willing to pay, and all of this, and mostly about why they attended and what they liked about the concerts. So they had actually very little data on this. And I would say that doing innovation starts with user needs. So if you don't collect any data, you can actually not start the innovation process. So number 3 barrier is that a lot of the innovation processes actually were from the perspective of the orchestras themselves, meaning that they would have discussions about, wouldn't this be a great concert? Maybe someone out there would think it's interesting. All right, let's do it. So the whole point of putting a program together, as well as the card, you know, a card where you can buy concerts for the whole year and so on, they were thought from within. So they weren't really meeting any kind of new audiences. Their perspective was purely seen from the orchestras themselves. And at the same time, and that's maybe these 2 points are interconnected, the audiences were mostly regarded as people who were supposed to be formated culturally. They were about to be educated. So literally they spoke of themselves as being on top of a ladder, on the highest trim of the ladder, and some of the new audiences were on the basic ladder, and the task was actually to have them move upwards. But seeing that from the perspective of the audiences or a guest, they're not really interested in being educated. They just want to have a good night out with the orchestra. So many people were feeling quite offended by this approach to them, because they didn't know actually who the composer was or so on. That wasn't interesting for the guests. It was more about the experiences. So they were not interested in being formatted. We also found that though they were good at developing formats. They were not quite good at testing them. So they launched formats without testing them on audiences. And that can be a barrier as well, because some of the times they said, okay, let's try this. And then they tried it and it didn't work, and they just discarded it instead of thinking, how can we improve it? So if you want to, improve your concepts, or you think you have a great idea, you have to test it a lot of time. And we didn't find that kind of environment. And the next point is, of course, a part of that barrier, some of barriers as well, is that they don't do any measuring. So you have to, if you're putting a new product or service or kind of concert format, as you would call it here, you actually have to measure whether this kind of concept is more interesting or less interesting than some of the other ways of attending a concert. And if you're not doing that, you still have no guideline on how to do your innovation and what you should develop. So that's a barrier as well. And the last barrier as well was that when we looked into the organizations of the orchestras, they were not sure about how to innovate. They knew very much about playing music and very much about being present in the concert hall, but how to do it were, they weren't sure about that, and they didn't really have the competences to do a structured process. Innovation is quite a lot about structure, and once you create the structure, everything explodes and becomes very messy, because innovation is incredibly messy. But that's why you have to be very structured about it as well. It's a strange combination, but you have to perform both, and you're not educated for that, being part of an orchestra. So it's a discipline that takes a lot of competences. All right. I will just move on to the next section, Denise. Thank you, because we also invested that most of the orchestras in Denmark, they are very well supported by state funding and local authorities funding them. So it's probably the branch in Denmark that is mostly heavily supported by government funding. But what we found was that I call it here a weak infrastructure around administration and development, because there were actually very often only symphony orchestras and ensembles as well. There were very few people working with this field of creating income streams. Mostly was a communication officer and some kind of administrator or a producer, but they were so few people, and when anything was burning somewhere else, they were running out of the office. So the infrastructure about this whole thing about making income streams work were very, very weak. And then we didn't see any kind of prioritization of innovation. Most of the priorities were, of course, about the music and the soloist and all of that, and some of the school programs. But once it came to innovation, it was like we could do that on the side for no money. And as I said before, it's actually quite expensive to do this. And if you don't do it, you don't develop new income streams. And then it becomes a barrier for business development, since you are doing the same thing the whole time, because you really can't afford, or you will not prioritize to develop new things. There is, of course, a widespread use of different ways of buying tickets and so on in Denmark, but pricing strategy was actually very It was very simple. It was more or less one kind of ticket, same price or whatsoever. But if you work with pricing strategies, that's where one of the places where you can actually earn some money, because you can pack it with other kinds of, food and drinks and parking and the next 3 tickets and all of that. And so this lack of pricing strategy was really a barrier, because that's where you can actually raise your income streams quite a lot, actually, by creating formats for different ways of engaging with the orchestra. I normally use the picture from the washing machine. When you drive your car, you can go for bronze or gold or silver, and you have to level the different ways of buying things. You saw very few partnerships, unfortunately, because partnerships is good in the sense that they can spread through their channels as well, concerts and events and so on. So you have a much larger audience if you have partners, but we saw very little of that, and that again is slowing down the business development. And we also saw that once you've created a new format, you wouldn't make what we would call a simple business case modeling. So, and you have to do that in order to say, well, is this going to cost us money, or will it be a new income stream? You have to do some calculations on that, and that kind of calculating wasn't present in the organization at the time. And then every time there was a cutback, I don't know if you know that from your place, it was always administration and communication who was to cut back, because the music is of course extremely important, but if no one knows the music is there, then you have a problem with your business. All right, I'm nearly there. 3 pieces of advice. I would do them very quickly, because then you can ask, of course, whatever you want to do. We are working together with the orchestras now. We have a 6-year program in Denmark now, where we are working with them until 2025. And the next step is to form strategies, really clear strategies, where the orchestra really wants to go and to set the course. And then, of course, we would say that you will have to choose who your audiences is, and you have to be quite well defined who you want to have as audiences, because it's expensive to get new audiences. And then the last thing that we would say is an important thing is that you should actually innovate together with your audiences. Our approach to innovation is design thinking, and in design thinking you will actually engage a number of people, and I think that would be very important to have a more clear stand in your community, that you could also actually work together with your audiences. I think the orchestras have to move where the audiences are and not the other way around. That was what I could say for now. I hope you have some questions as well.
Thank you so much, Søren, for that great presentation. I hope I did my job well as a...
You did your job perfectly, Denise.
You conducted me well, so it worked pretty naturally.
It's like my old days at television, they were just running through.
Yeah, so thanks a lot for your presentation. Really fascinating. What really struck me was your comment on innovation is about structure. And then, of course, you're facing structures that are, as Anna has also said, often decades, centuries old. So working against windmills, basically.
Yeah, it struck me as well as Anna was talking that it's not to be rude or anything, but it's a very conservative environment.
Yeah, especially I can imagine if you also work together with theaters and museums, then of course orchestras are again a very special sort of organization.
Yeah, absolutely, but great. Yeah.
So I want to give the floor to the audience. If there are any questions for Søren. Otherwise, I have some, of course. I always have some in petto, but I wonder if there's also anyone else who would like to chip in first.
Hello.
Oh, Daniel.
Yeah,
great.
again me.
Hello.
Hello. Well, thank you so much for your presentation. Yeah, like I was wondering about like getting data. Do you see, have you seen like maybe how people react to being asked about like the experience they have? Because I see like, okay, you said some people go there and only want to have a yeah, nice night out, and maybe it's a kind of annoying if they come to you to
Absolutely.
ask you, okay, what do you feel, or which
Yeah.
strategies do you do to interview these people?
Yeah. We prefer to conduct user journey mapping, because that's another way of understanding how people attend concerts. So that is generally where if people have been part of a concert, they will generally be interviewed for like an hour or half an hour, 1.5 hours afterwards, to be very thorough about the different steps in their user journey. So people have to sign up for that, of course, because it takes a lot of time, but that's one way of doing it. And sometimes you can do it by very short questions, like 3 or 4 or 5 questions when they are on their way out, or in the break. The break is a very good normally there is a break, and it's a very good place to actually ask people, because they're waiting to get their glass of wine or coffee or anything of that, and you could even give them a free coffee if they want to answer some of these brief questions. And then we think that we are trying to help some of the orchestras to do the focus groups themselves, where they interview a group of people who maybe are there for the first time or have been there many times, to get some idea about how they actually what kind of experiences they have in the concert hall. So there are many methods, many approaches, and they will give different answers actually in the way to perform them, I would say.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you, Daniel. And I see Anna has a question.
Hi, guys. I have a question regarding like the final goal of the orchestras that went through this process. Like, was it mainly like to increase revenue or to diversify their audiences, or did they have like some specific main goal?
No, no, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. No, like, and I'm just curious, like, what were the like orchestras that went through this process? I'm curious about how they changed and how they developed their themselves after going through the process.
They haven't been through the process all in all yet.
Oh, okay.
No, we're actually in the middle of it, but it's a very good question, because they do have different goals. I would say at the time when we started back in 2019, they were quite nervous about the funding, and we call it legitimacy, because you have to prove to your funders that you're actually worth putting money in. And since they are receiving quite a lot of money, they needed to prove that they were actually reaching a new number. So in the first place, they were quite interested in how can we have a greater impact on audiences. And they know, because the reality of economics in this field is that it's not a money machine, not at all. But you can get money for some kind of development if you attract new audiences. It will never be some kind of capitalistic machine anyway, no way. But people were actually quite interested in creating a greater revenue. They always are, but it's difficult, you know. Yeah. I think that when we come, we are starting to build the strategies now, and they are very different. Some live in urban environments where they will actually try to gain more young people in. What the I would say the issue is for a lot of them still is that you have to actually look at your repertoire. You will have to look at what kind of music you are playing, and you will have to look at how you play it and in what circumstances you play it. So you have to alter your way of thinking about how you normally do things. And that's hard.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Very good question, right? Why do the orchestras actually come to you, and what's the sort of goal? What's in for them, right? Yeah, is there anyone else who would like to chip into the discussion? Guru.
Okay, this time I unmuted.
Hello.
Hello. Thank you very much for this presentation. I actually agree with you on a lot of things. Also about, I think that there is a lot of information going on that people, when they think of a classical music concert, they immediately think, oh, do I know the composers which is going to play? Do I know where to clap? Do I know what to wear? And all this image the classical music world has that they really hold on to, unfortunately, quite. Yeah, that's why I was very surprised when you said that one can just really relaxed go to the audience while they're waiting for their coffee and interview them, because I think actually I have the impression they wouldn't like that, or they would be afraid that they would give wrong answers.
No.
How did you find the concert? Like saying, I don't know, it was nice, or, you know, like, I don't think they could be really honest.
All right.
About if they didn't like, or I'm not so sure if just going to the audience would give one the honest feedback that one needs for a research.
No, it's because you can do research in many ways. So of course, having a direct contact is a very, very limited way of getting data back from the audiences. But you have to remember one thing, because we seldom do it in that way, but sometimes we have students to ask people about how they feel, and then they have 5 questions on an iPad, and then they just, punch it in. But I think people actually really like to talk about their experience. So if you are curious about how people feel in the concert hall, they will naturally like to answer. A lot of the audiences that we have talked to in different settings, they often, when they are newcomers, they often feel very disappointed that no one talks to them afterwards, for instance. So, oh, I'm just being put out from the back door. Why can't I have a beer and a glass of wine and discuss? And why can't anyone come out and tell me what was going on? And you see the same thing at the beginning of the visit in the concert house. We are just now we're just conducting 30 user journey interviews with different target groups, and a common across all of them, because they really like classical music, but they have just never attended a symphony concert before. And they say it's really odd because we're just being put into that room and suddenly it starts. No one says anything. No one tells us what's coming or how we should be in the room. So people need some guidance, actually. I think they like to talk about it. And if they could give their view on this, I think they would love it.
Thank you very much. That's very good to know, because I always thought otherwise.
I really don't think that you should hold back on that.
Yes, and there's still Anna with what's probably a very last question, I'm assuming.
I was just gonna quickly react to Søren. So they do want to be educated. I was puzzled by that comment that you said audiences don't want to be educated.
No, I think actually the audiences want to educate the orchestras, to be honest, because if you're answering a question, they would often answer it, how could you improve? We would like this instead of this. So in the sense of the experience, I think that the orchestras can actually learn quite a lot from the concert goers. After all, concert goers are experts in going to a concert. The musicians are experts in playing the music. So it's 2 different kinds of worlds, really. But your question is really interesting as well, because just 2 days ago, I was interviewing some people who had been to the concert, and by mistake, they went into a room where there was an introduction to the concert. And they really liked that introduction, because they said if we hadn't gone through the wrong door, there was no signs or anything, but if they hadn't gone through the wrong door, they wouldn't have had a clue about what was going on that night. So in that sense, they need context to understand what is going on. But education, most of them feel quite capable themselves already, not about music, but being human, I mean, yeah.
Yes, thank you so much, Søren. I think we might have come to a sort of more natural end of the discussion. I'm not sure if there's some last remark or some very last question that we can
May I say something, a very last remark? Yeah, because I really like your presentation, Anna. And I think when we're talking about innovation and business development as well, people need to see themselves reflected in the ones who plays in the orchestras. And if they are all very conservative and very hierarchical and male dominant, I think you won't attract many women to that kind of concerts in the future. So I think actually you have to think also about this issue in terms of program and in terms of presence in front of the audiences.
Yes,
I think you're right, and I just a last comment or a brief reply for that. What you said about they don't know maybe the audience how to behave in a concert, and that just reminds me of how there are so many unwritten rules that maybe as a person in classical music or you're very like you know the field and you know the composers and all of that. There's many times you don't see how it is, how like kind of narrow it is. Let's say you don't even notice that it's only male composers, but then when somebody from the outside comes, they're like, wait a second, this is not.
Exactly.
Then people notice, in a different way, in a good way.
Yeah.
With new fresh eyes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. I think that's a great last remark. And with that, I think we'll end the session. Thank you so much, Anna and Søren, for sharing your insights, for sharing your work with us. It was so insightful. Thanks also to the audience for all the great questions. Do get in touch with the speakers if you want to know more. Feel free to make contact. And otherwise, we'll see you back tomorrow, hopefully, at 10 a.m. in the morning. And I'm really much looking forward to it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Gülru, also for your questions. I forgot to say thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.